Tonight, we're going to talk about the journalism jobs crisis, a call to action. Our team at the Field Foundation, along with friends of the Institute for Independent Journalists, have come together to unpack IIJ's groundbreaking survey. Circulated by nearly 36 journalism organizations, the survey reveals the human cost behind the devastating industry layoffs. At Field, we've had long-standing commitment to supporting community-based journalism and storytelling in Chicago communities. To date, we have made more than $7 million in grants to support journalism and storytelling over the past 6 years. These investments are due in large part to our funding partners, including the Chicago Community Trust, the Democracy Fund, the Ford Foundation, and our friends at the MacArthur Foundation, which has enabled the Field Foundation to double its impact and grow the local network of journalists. I'd like to thank our Field team, Reese Castro and Maria McCandless, for their work and bringing us all together. Let's give them a little. And then a very special thanks to our journalism and storytelling program officer, Meredith D, who has, with her wisdom, been our North Star, and has led the way for the field-funded research that exposes how women, mid-career professionals, and journalists of color are bearing the heaviest burden. Here in Impact House, where dozens of foundations come to work together, we're not just discussing challenges, we're creating a town square centered on impact and opportunity. And tonight, led by a stellar panel of industry experts, we'll transform this moment of uncertainty into a pathway for meaningful action. The need for reliable, fact-based information has never been greater, and this evening we will explore the path forward for journalism. We want to again thank our funding partners, our field team, and you, our friends. So thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Maudlin. And please drink a lot of wine and eat a lot of cheese.
Hi guys, thank you all for being here today. I always say you can build it, but it doesn't mean they'll come. And many of you are probably tired of hearing from me from the last 2 weeks of constant emails to make sure you come. I'm so grateful that you have your butt in the chair, and more grateful that we are having this amazing, amazing conversation. The reason is because, it hasn't stopped. Just last week, iHeartMedia, announced their round of layoffs, 5% of their staff. And then today, as I was doing my constant posting about this event, because we all know if you don't post it on social media, it didn't happen, right? I saw a couple of posts from people. I saw a post from a young woman who was laid off from the Better Government Association, the Answers Project, just last week, and then I found out that another good friend of ours who was in the room, who responded to her, was also laid off recently from the organization we've always attached her name to. So what I'm saying is this is ongoing, and there has never been a more important time to have this conversation. I want to thank the most phenomenal woman and entrepreneur that I know, Ms. Katherine Lewis Reynolds, for leading the charge on this. Katherine came to me not so long ago and said, hey, this is happening. 8,400 journalists nationwide in the last 2 years alone. We gotta find out who's being laid off because it's not tracked anymore. And you'll hear more from folks about that. And I was like, okay, what do we do? She said, we need to do a survey. I'm like, I'm in. So Field Foundation supported and funded the survey that they did and they'll tell you all about it. But I will just say that without her caring, without her dedication to supporting independent journalists, those who are freelancing, those who have been laid off, those who are out here trying to make a living, this wouldn't have happened. And when she came back with the findings, and you'll hear that, but it hit me hard. Women, BIPOC journalists, mid-career journalists, and you'll hear more about that. It hit me. I was like, it's what we suspect, but to hear it and to see it in the data and in the self-reporting, that's a whole nother thing. So we started talking. How do we get the word out? How do we amplify this? And this is what we came up with. And we had the most amazing panel tonight. I want to just shout out a couple of people. Tim Franklin, an absolute powerhouse in Chicago. He is on the board of every journalism organization, on the task force at every government level, and he is just, someone who knows this information through the annual surveys that they do about local news nationwide. I just want to thank you so much for joining. And everyone else here, my heart. Thank you all so much. Deborah, those questions, oh my God, everything I ever dreamed of. Meredith, I can't believe we got you in Chicago. And Alyssa, thanks for giving from your heart and for sharing your personal story. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, our amazing moderator. And wait. Okay, I had her biography, but I don't have it in my hand now. So I'm just going to tell you that Deborah Douglas is, number one of my dearest friends. And number two, she is director of the Solutions Journalism Network Midwest Hub at Medill Northwestern University. And she is a phenomenal journalist who has worked everywhere, including the maybe nearly 2 decades she and I worked together at the Chicago Sun-Times. She was in management and I was a reporter, and she steered that paper admirably. And I think that she has a personal story with Layoffs on that issue. But anyway, I'll turn it over to Deborah. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, panel.
If Mom has something to say, then we are all duty bound to listen. And I would just say my quick layoff story is that journalism is not where you work, it's who you are, if you want it to be. I just want to do quick introductions of our distinguished panelists. I'm first going to introduce Meredith D. Clark. Meredith is a recovery journalist. She describes herself as an associate professor of race and political communication in the Hussman School of Journalism at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And her book, her forthcoming book, is called We Tried to Tell Y'all, Black Twitter and the Rise of Digital Counter-Narratives. This is the queen of Black Twitter. And I'm so pleased to be here with you, Meredith. Meredith, I have a bunch of friends in this room, but Meredith is one of them. The last time I was graced to be on a stage with you, we were at the Harvard School of Public Health talking about reparations. We're gonna get ours. And so thank you, Meredith, for being here. Next, we have Alyssa Edes. She's an audio creator based in Chicago with 12 years of experience in mission-driven journalism. And she previously covered the Supreme Court for WNYC's award-winning podcast, More Perfect. There's so much more to say about her. She's going to share more of that with some visual aids a little bit later in the night. And next is Tim Franklin, Senior Associate Dean, Professor, and the John M. Muntz Chair in Local News at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, Media and Integrated Marketing Communications, where he leads the Medill Local News Initiative and the Medill Metro Media Lab. Also, Tim is my own personal dean, because that's my boss. And then finally, we have the illustrious Katherine Reynolds Lewis, the founder of the Institute for Independent Journalists, which serves freelancers of color and a columnist for Neiman Reports. And she's an award-winning science journalist, educator, and author covering children, behavioral and mental health, education, race, gender, disability, and equity for many illustrious publications. So thank you all for being here. So I'm just going to frame the discussion by pulling directly from some language in the report. Women and people of color were disproportionately represented In the 176 responses received from laid-off journalists, women comprise 68% of survey respondents, but only 46% of the journalism workforce, and this is from a Pew Research analysis. Journalists with less than 3 years in a job made up a majority of respondents, 52%, as did those aged 26 to 45, 70%. And journalists of color were 42% of survey respondents, but only represent 17% of the labor force. So Katherine and I, we work together all the time, and so I know that this survey has been in the works for quite some time, and the results are harrowing enough on their own. But I also think during the course of our discussion, we'll need to evaluate the results in the context of the election results, because President-elect Trump has indicated an intention to diminish the role of the press with specific threats, and we can get into those a little bit later too. But first, I'm going to tee up the first question for Katherine to tease out some specifics from the results and explain the implications for journalism's future and the pipeline for future journalists.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I just want to start by thanking the Field Foundation of Illinois for jumping in with us to survey laid-off journalists, and Maudlin, Reese, Maria, and Matt, and everyone who has been such a great partner, because we wouldn't really know the stories if we hadn't been able to go out and talk to people. One of the problems with trying to track who is laid off through some of the demographics is that you don't always know how people identify. So we wanted to start by asking people to self-report so that we would know how they identified in terms of all the different factors in terms of their identities. So the Institute for Independent Journalists is a 2-year-old organization whose mission is the financial and emotional sustainability of freelancers of color. And you set out the survey, as you heard, with up to 38 questions about their demographics, the impact on them, the role that they had in journalism. The survey is still open. Folks are welcome to continue to take it if you'd like to. And we did a blanket outreach. So even though this is not a statistically significant sample, it is, we had a ton of partners helping us distribute the survey, so we built a reasonable snapshot. This is the project team, so I want to also shout out to Taylor Keither, who's in the room, or the help you check in at the front desk, who is not on the slide but was instrumental in pushing this across the finish line. So we found this just dramatic, disproportionate impact on journalists of color. So journalists of color are only 17% of the journalism workforce. And that's a number that really has not changed in the 20 plus years that I've been a journalist. And as you can see, almost 3 times as much represented in laid-off journalists as in the industry overall. When you look at the detailed race and ethnicity demographics, Asian American journalists were the hardest hit, followed by Hispanic and then Black journalists. And white journalists were not as represented in the House as they are in the industry. And women and non-binary journalists were also disproportionately impacted. So even though women are almost half, 46% of the workforce overall, we represented 2/3 of the laid-off journalists, and then non-binary journalists were 5%. In terms of age, I think this is another big concern because of what you're saying about the pipeline, that our folks in the core working years, 26 to 45, were 71% of laid-off journalists. So these are our future user leaders and managers, and we're losing them. We also saw this very dramatic. People who had a new job in the last 3 years were the ones who were the most represented. So those are the folks who were hired in the summer of 2020, when various things were happening in the country, and they were then laid off subsequently. In terms of years in journalism, again, we see the 7 to 10 and 11 to 15 years in journalism. Those were the biggest chunks of folks laid off, which is the sweet spot of people who have experience and are our future leaders. And then these are disability numbers and sexual orientation. So 17% of the laid-off journalists we surveyed had reported disability, and 28% identified as LGBTQ+. So those are the numbers, but I also want to just share just a bit of what I heard from folks who did feel that their identity was as journalists, and they lost that identity with the layoff. So people reported deep depression, feeling that they couldn't get support from their colleagues, that there was almost like a stigma of being a laid off journalist where people weren't worried it was catching, if you sort of run into someone, they make an awkward joke because they're so concerned about their own future. And I interviewed one person who was in the Columbia Journal's review story that we wrote on the survey, who was actually working 3 part-time jobs post-layoff and making more than she was making in local news. So this is something I think will come up again, which is that it's not like our newsrooms are such great, healthy places to work to begin with, but then when you lose that touch point of your identity, it can really be completely destabilizing. So people that we interviewed had, taken a year to just recover from burnout or from what the experience of being in a newsroom was. One person who took the survey was laid off 2 times in 1 year. So she lost her job and then found a new one and then was laid off again. So it's just this churn that really destabilizes human beings, who are the people that we rely on for our news and information, and really makes them question whether they can stay in journalism. And that, I think, is the starkest finding, was just the personal stories.
Being laid off twice in 1 year can do a number on you. And it's really not about the individual at all. It's really about the business model. I want to pivot to Meredith. You've done some innovative work in measuring demographics and the shape of people. Well, your work is not innovative. You don't do anything that's not innovative. But how do we know who's in the journalism workforce in the first place? And why don't we know more? And what happens to this work now, since nobody is measuring it? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb. Well, we don't know because people who are in positions of power don't want us to know. I think the most eye-opening aspect of working on the Newsroom Diversity Survey, which is older than I am, I think it's a year or 2 older than I am, the most eye-opening aspect was the lack of participation and how intentional it was. And it's a lot easier to talk about the problem of layoffs and the problem of the workforce in the abstract when you don't have those figures. Whereas we would never accept this from any other industry. We are always pressuring industries like technology, like the federal government, like local and state governments, to be transparent about their numbers. But meeting with newspaper editors and publishers who had a number of different reasons for not wanting to participate was frankly frightening in some cases. Everything from motivations about whether that data could be essentially used against them in negotiations where people were trying to organize, or if that data would come out and one of the most common responses we had was, we don't want to make our colleagues feel bad. And so we're worried about feelings rather than facts. Now that AS&E has folded, NLA has folded, the question is what happens to this work? And I think that this work finally meets the end that the men who were the American Society of Newspaper Editors when this work first started reaches the point that they always wanted it to reach. They never wanted to do it. And so it has come to the point where it has lived out the life cycle, and that is not a concern they have to have anymore. They don't have to be accountable to the public. They don't have to be accountable to their newsrooms. They don't have to be accountable to the rest of the world, and literally the world, because we got calls from all over the world about people who wanted to know how we did this work and how they could do it in their own countries. They no longer have to be responsible for that. And I think in this particular political moment, it proves advantageous because it's one of the ways that you can say that we're not complicit in what's happening in terms of who gets favorable coverage or how we cover corrupt politicians and authoritarians because we don't know who's there. We're just doing the job. So it has reached its full life cycle. I hope that someone, and I say someone, but it will need to be a group of organizations working together, namely organizations that are not membership driven, to pick up the mantle of doing this work and recognizing that it has to be done in a number of different ways. One of the things about the IIJ's approach to this is recognizing that freelance journalists weren't well counted in the NLA data. And so that is something that shows you just one of the many pieces that needs to be picked up in this work as it moves forward.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at a little bit too, about how it's not where you work, because that's not the fullness of it. And I remember in undergrad studying ASNE studies, that Lauren Gilliam had this parity survey that it is constant update. So these questions are not new. We heard from you what's at stake when we don't get the answers, or who benefits from not giving the answers. But I'm just wondering from the rest of the panel, especially Katherine and Tim, if you have any insights about that.
First I want to thank Field Foundation for hosting this event, and IIJ and Katherine for your work. And if I could, I thought maybe I'd provide a little national context around
Absolutely, please.
Around this discussion, and this is why your survey is so important. So at Medill, we have the largest database in the nation of local news outlets. We also track employment of journalists. And we release an annual report, the Medill State of Local News Project. We just released it at the end of last month. Some of you have probably seen it. So we have the overall raw numbers from that report. What you have done, which is so important, is tell us who has been laid off. But just to give you some quick stats, the newspaper industry has lost 70% of its journalists in the last 20 years. That's 266,000 people. That's the fourth highest industry loss. So I think it's just behind textiles and the makers of CDs and cassette tape players in terms of loss. And to bring it home locally, in Illinois, you want to lead the nation in a lot of things, but you don't want to lead the nation in job loss. So on a percentage basis, Illinois has lost 86% of its newspaper journalists in the last 20 years. And in Cook County, in the 10 years ending in 2018, Cook County led the nation in journalism job loss in 2018. So I think there are lots of reasons for that, and we can get into that. And in the report that we just published a few weeks ago, I don't want to sound like Dr. Doom, but it showed that about 2.5 newspapers a week are closing in the U.S. 130 publications closed just last year alone. There were 7,000, according to our numbers, 7,000 jobs lost just in the last 12 months, ending in September of this year. So I think that tracks pretty close to the numbers that you have. And so this problem is accelerating. There are 206 news deserts. 1,561 counties in the U.S. are down to one local news source. So more than half of the counties in the U.S. either have no local news or only limited access to local news, which I think constitutes a crisis for communities and for our democracy, ultimately. So Illinois has been one of the harder hit states. Illinois has 5 news desert counties, most of them in southern Illinois. Medill also, with our data science team, we created a predictive model of watch list counties across the U.S. These are counties at high risk of becoming news deserts. There are 279 counties on our watch list. This year, last year there were only 228. I say only 228. So I know that's a lot of numbers, but I just thought for this conversation it might be good to have that context. And again, it just highlights the really important work that Katherine and IIJ and Field have done in putting a face on this problem.
I appreciate that context. That 86% number is concerning. It reminds me of an environmental scan of the Detroit news landscape that I edited many, many years ago. There was a quote that stood out from the writer, Deborah Simmons. It was a quote that said something about Pulitzer-level talent being left on the cutting room floor. And so when I think about the kind of and quality of journalists who are not getting the opportunity, I think about that. Thank you so much for that, Tim.
Sure. By the way, there are some bright spots too. Don't despair. I've
I
got some
was
bright
going to
spots
circle
on
back
there.
to that. I'm
Yeah.
solutions
Yeah.
journalism girl. We
Yeah.
can back in.
There are some hopeful signs. So it's not all gloom or doom, really.
So I want to get personal. So I'm going to cycle over to you, Alyssa, to hear the personal story about being laid off, about the cost of being laid off for you, and how it impacted your sense of self and identity, and your ability to continue working as a journalist.
Yeah, I'm the audio person. I don't know if the mic is working. Yeah, thank you, Deb. Thank you for that question. I would say the costs to me personally were similar to what we see borne out in the data of what is happening to a lot of people who are laid off. For me, it was really threefold. I would say mentally, there was a cost. There was a cost to my faith in journalism and the institutions that run it, and of course financially. So to start with mentally, I was already on my way to a pretty deep burnout before the layoffs happened, in large part because of the environment in which journalism is being made today. We're all run down, we're all overworked, we've been through a lot of trauma, and the demands seem to just keep getting higher to push more and more content out with less and less resources. So, in that sense, I would say the layoffs really pushed that burnout to another level, where it really did become a clinical burnout. In terms of my faith in journalism, again, I was already disappointed in the ways that our institutions have been treating us as workers, and the ways that sort of the editorial standards get imposed from the top down, without discussion from the people who are actually making the work, from the people who have ideas about what kind of things they want to put out into the world. And the layoffs, the collapse overall in the industry, and also my personal experience at my station, New York Public Radio, really seemed to sort of confirm my skepticism and my disillusionment. And then in terms of, financially, obviously losing your job, they're taking away your livelihood, your ability to live, and your health care. And I think that newsroom leaders should really keep that in mind more, and apologize when that happens. For me, again, because of the burnout that I was experiencing, I needed to take time off. I probably would have needed to take time off no matter what, even if I hadn't been laid off, because of what I was going through. But instead of getting paid disability leave that I needed, I had to fund my own leave myself. I think that experience is reflective of a lot of folks who are laid off. I know it's not just me. And in terms of, you asked about sense of self, which has come up a little bit already in this conversation. We are taught as journalists from day one that journalism is not just what we do, but it is who we are. And I'm here to tell you, this is not the case. We are not our jobs. Even if we love our jobs, even if our jobs feel like they're part of a calling, we are not our employment. And it's one thing to know that like, you know, logically, but it's another thing to be able to feel that. And it did impact my sense of self greatly. You know, who are you without like doing something meaningful in the world? Who are you without, you know, being part of this profession, this calling that we have, so many of us have dedicated our lives to, have poured ourselves into at the detriment of everything else in our life. And it took me time. It took me time to recover from that, and I would encourage everyone here, regardless of whether you've been laid off, regardless of whether you're in journalism or have recovering from journalism, to think about, you know, who you are outside of this work.
Yeah.
What you love, who you want to spend your time with, what is meaningful to you. Those are the things that make up who you are, not your job.
Thank you for so much, Alyssa.
I mean,
I know, right? Get a life. Okay. So, Tim, I want to circle back to you, and hopefully, maybe we can point to some of the highlights or the high points that you alluded to. Just thinking about the latest research release that you just made, I'm wondering if you have a couple of insights that you can share that informs what is needed to shore up the journalism workforce, or if there's any like bright spots you can point to that address some of the issues that have come up so far.
Sure. No, I'm happy to talk about very happy to talk about bright spots. So, I mean, first of all, we all know in this room that the business model has collapsed. The industry's lost 60% of its ad revenue in the last 10 years, and that made up the vast majority of income for most news organizations. So you can't lose 60% of your main revenue source and not have that have a big impact on you. But I am seeing entrepreneurs out there that are creating new models for local news across the country that I think are encouraging. So in the report we just released, for the first time since we began keeping these stats, there was a net increase of 81 digital-only news sites across the country. It was the first time we'd seen a net increase in digital-only local news sites. Typically, in an average year, about the same number of digital sites go out of business as get started. So I think that's really an important data point, and I'm not here to say it's a trend yet, but I'm encouraged, and hopefully that will continue to grow. There have been about 259 local news startups across the country in the last 5 years, both print and digital, most of them digital. So I think that is encouraging as well. And let me just say, to bring this to Chicago, I think has become an incubator of innovation for local news. And I see it all over the city, and it really gives me hope when I see it. And I hate to start naming news outlets because I'm going to leave some worthy ones out. But it includes legacies and startups. So I'm thinking of La Raza, and Jesus del Toro is in the back, just named the National Hispanic Publication of the Year nationally. He was the Hispanic Publisher of the Year. La Raza was part of our local news accelerator, which we started a couple of years ago. I see others in the room who have been part of the accelerator, as well as our Media Innovation and Leadership Academy. That's one great example. We all know about Block Club Chicago, which I think may be the most successful digital local news startup in America in the last 6 years, and I think they've found a way to sustainability, and I love the work that they're doing. And again, I don't want to leave anybody out because there's so many worthy of mention, but that really gives me hope. And so we're seeing news organizations with diversified revenue streams now, and in reader revenue, in memberships, and donations, and events, and philanthropy, and in creating in-house marketing agencies inside their own business that are serving their communities and other ways. And I think that's all really, really encouraging. And in terms of the future, the one thing that gives me hope too is there's more visibility now around this problem and around this crisis, and that's where it starts. We all know about Press Forward and the $500 million plus being poured into local news because of Press Forward, and thanks to the Field Foundation and MacArthur and CCT and others in Chicago that are helping to lead the way on that front. And that's not going to solve the local news problem, but it's going to give a lot of news organizations some runway, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, to figure out a pathway to sustainability, and I think that that's so important. And then I'm happy to talk more about this, but I was appointed by the governor to the bipartisan Illinois Journalism Task Force. We introduced a series of recommendations early last year. Happy to say that a package passed and was signed by the governor last year to help local news in Illinois. It's going to provide tax credits to local news organizations that hire journalists and that retain journalists. So I think in terms of helping to solidify the employment base of journalism in the state of Illinois, happily now, after having been one of the leaders in losses, is now taking the lead in public policy to try to help grow the number of journalists in newsrooms. So I was really thrilled that happened. It also includes a journalism scholarship program. So journalism students who agree to work for an Illinois news outlet the first 2 years after graduation will get a journalism scholarship paid for by the state. So I think that's a big step forward. And then it also includes what we call a replanting strategy, which says that if a local news outlet wants to sell to an out-of-town news organization, that it has to give at least 120 days notice to that community, which will give local businesses, local community leaders, an opportunity to maybe try to acquire that news outlet before it goes to an out-of-state entity. So I think that also is a real step forward. So anyway, all of that, sorry to prattle on, but to me, those are all reasons for optimism amid all of the other trends.
Thank you for surfacing that. And maybe a little bit later in the questioning, you could talk about some high points in some other states too, because there's a lot going on across the nation.
Yeah, sure,
I'll
absolutely.
circle back to that. I just wanted to surface also to Alyssa's point about the support or the lack thereof, and your point about the burgeoning nonprofit startup landscape, is that there's a certain freedom in these in the sort of like human resource development of these nonprofit outlets. I'm a 2-time founder, and there's a certain freedom in being able to say that we're going to agree to stop work at a certain time, or that we don't have to react to everything. And that in the process of creating outlets that address the narrative harm that we've created with legacy journalism, that we also usher in some more healing and holistic practices for how to go to work. So thank you for that. I want to cycle back to you, Meredith, and bring up a quote that I believe was in the CJR article that announced the survey results. You said that all the strategies we can throw at funding journalism are meaningless if the people are broken. And so my question for you is, what mental health and well-being support systems should be industry standards? And I'll kick it off with Meredith, but of course I want to hear from the rest of the panel if you have insights.
The go-to measures that we need to consider if we're going to continue to exist in the systems that exist, and we're going to continue to labor under capitalism the way that we are, and that means that our health insurance and coverage is tied to our employment, then that employment has to include funding and time for mental health treatment. Recognizing that even if you work in the most supportive environment in journalism, you are still repeatedly exposed to traumatic incidents. You are relied upon by people in communities who are experiencing traumatic incidents, and then you serve as the de facto counselor for them as they are processing this information. I think we also need to really focus on who is in the newsrooms and moving people who are harmful, which few want to actually say and identify. The layers that we have of human resources management, which is really designed to protect the institution and not the individual, has often gotten in the way of moving those people who are directly harmful to members of their staff. My example is I'm here and I'm not answering emails. I'm not. I don't care what's happening. I tell my students I'm not that kind of doctor. If there's some sort of I can't help you. But the same is true in journalism. If you drop dead tomorrow, someone else will do your job. And so you have to internalize the willingness to put yourself first as an individual, as an ethic of care, not only for yourself, but for the communities that you serve.
That's so funny that you mentioned someone would do your job, because one time I had a dental emergency and someone did do my job.
But sometimes that, Deb, we are professionals here. We can do this. I'm like, not the way I can. Tim and Katherine, did you want to follow up to that?
Well, I don't know that anyone can follow Dr. Clark.
Right.
But I will say I see this too at the Institute for Independent Journalists. So I started my independent journalism career after a mass layoff. Newhouse News Service closed their DC bureau, and 26 of us lost our jobs. And in the last 16 years, I hear from so many colleagues when they leave a newsroom to start off on their own. That's why I started the IIJ, because I got tired of hearing from them as they were starting and then getting a LinkedIn update that they were doing PR for Citibank. Which, no shade, whoever wants, everyone needs PR, but there are, in many ways, being independent is the solution for a lot of journalists to toxic newsrooms, to overwork, because we can prioritize ourselves, and we have to learn to set healthy boundaries with work, because otherwise you would have 12 bosses, right? When you're a freelancer, you have multiple clients, you need to really communicate well and set good boundaries and prioritize your own health and your healthcare. And my positive note for this conversation is that journalists are knowledge workers, right? We'll have long careers if we take care of our bodies and our minds and our hearts. And so this urgency, this false urgency of have to get the story today is what we need to turn away from, and instead think about long-term, what do I want my impact to be, and how can I create the career that aligns with those values. And often freelancing is the solution for many journalists, because you can have a portfolio of work. Some pays really great and some really has the impact that you want to make. And you get to step out of that toxic newsroom and wait for the news organizations to change and adopt some of the practices that Dr. Clark is talking about.
Yeah, Tim, you led the Pointer Institute and Greg the Comedian, Greg Bloomberg. You've done all things, so I'm interested in hearing your insights.
Yeah, and my wife was here, so she could comment about my not setting boundaries for many years. When it came to work and phone calls at 3 o'clock in the morning to get up and report a story or to go into the office. I think that newsrooms have a very long way to go, for sure. I think they have gotten better, and I'm old enough that I've seen this progression over time. And when I think about this, I worry about the students that are coming out of Medill these days, or any journalism school, UNC, for that matter, and having the support systems in place inside organizations to help nurture them and to help grow them, because a lot of news organizations are so strapped that that trying to find your way in a news organization these days is tough. And so whether having mentorship programs inside of newsrooms to help newly onboarded journalists, especially young journalists, I think is really important. And the other thing that's happening because of this local news crisis, and I talked to publishers and editors about this, is that back when dinosaurs walked the earth and I came out of college, there was kind of this linear pathway to moving up into management or into senior jobs. And now we're seeing a lot of, this is not in your head, now we're seeing a lot of younger journalists being thrown into larger management roles at an earlier age, often with no training or background or assistance or help in how to do those jobs. And that then leads to burnout among those folks before they even really get their careers going. So I think we need these systems in place, these support systems, to nurture and develop young journalists. I'm especially concerned with the students coming out of journalism schools these days for obvious reasons.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So picking up where Meredith left off, but this is really a question for the entire panel, is how do we
go about creating a culture of accountability for who's in the newsroom and how those newsrooms comport themselves with regard to the people who are being in the streets to cover the news every day. Thanks, that.
She said that's a question for her.
Well, I would say another thing that I'm excited about is the growth of worker-owned news organizations, the objective, which is media coverage, their beat is the media. So we need to be able to cover ourselves as a beat. And I came out of business journalism, so I'm happy to be part of that. I think that the more that we can hold journalism accountable in the way we do every other institution in our entire country, that's what's needed. And part of that, I think, is having more truly independent news coverage. If you think about the news deserts, another thing filling those voids is individual journalists, right? So one independent freelancer who has a Substack that covers a community or covers a space, a topic, is filling a news void. And that person can be sustainable in a way that someone trying to launch a two-person newspaper is not going to be. So I think that's the other thing, is being more open-minded about what it looks like to provide news and information that a community needs, and who can do that job, right? Are we gatekeeping that unless you are a 501c3, you cannot access the resources that will allow you to provide coverage to that news, to that organization? Unless you have a degree in journalism, you're not allowed to do that job. What are the barriers that are preventing folks in a community from getting access to the news and information that an individual wants to provide?
Thank you.
Just to follow up on Katherine's very good point, we also track ownership of local news outlets. And while it's small, there is a little bit of growth that we're seeing in employee-owned local news operations. So is anybody from the Daily Herald here? The Daily Herald, the suburban chain of publications, is now an ESOP. It's an employee stock ownership plan owned by the employees. And if you go to our Medill Local News Initiative site and look at our report, we have a whole category called Bright Spots, and we profile 12 innovators in local news and write about what they're doing that's special. And one of them is a relatively new digital startup, Charlottesville Tomorrow in Virginia, that is 49% employee owned. And so I think we're beginning to see more of that. There also are some places, still not enough, but a few, that are co-ops. So they're effectively owned by the community. And I really think this is a model that could emerge nationally, but the idea is community members buy memberships into a co-op, and then they elect a board, and then the board oversees the publisher and the editor. So it's really the community not only has a direct say in the operation of that news outlet, but the publisher and the editor report back to the board of the co-op. It's like the old savings and loan co-ops, for those of you who might remember those. It's the same kind of principle. So there are some of those new models, and also in California, Berkeley side did what they call a direct public offering, where they, to fund themselves as they were getting started, they sold shares, like stock, to members of the community. And then when there were profits at the end of the year, there were profits, then those went back to the community members who bought stock in that publication. So there are these new models that are kind of developed that are more accountable, to your point, that are more community-centric, and then I think are healthy. It's almost like the Green Bay, I call it the Green Bay Packers business model, for those of you who are familiar. We don't want to talk about the Packers this week. There you can buy stock in the football team. So it's the same kind of thing with journalism, and hopefully those journalism organizations won't block field goals in the last seconds of the game. Not that I'm still sensitive. Not that I'm still sensitive about that loss.
I want to give Alyssa some time to share some insights about the detrimental effect of the layoffs on the the entire ecosystem, not only at the individual level, but the institutional level. You have something to share with them, so like that. Yeah, should I share the presentation for yeah? Not the whole thing, just some high points of the chat.
Do you need a working mic?
Yeah, this one doesn't work.
I would recommend using Deborah's. This one is a little gets stuck.
Yep.
She used to be like that, but it's just the high points from the representation at the others the high points without the whole shit hurts out the vision like institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, first of all, just to follow up on what Tim was saying, you're giving me many good ideas. And I want to talk to you after about that. Because I also came to a similar conclusion of, these institutions are not serving us and in the way that they should be, and we're not able to do the work that we want to be doing in a lot of them right now. And so we need to seize the means of production. We need to become, we need to become our own bosses. And so I am also starting a small Chicago audio collective to tell stories by and for Chicagoans. We don't have anything like that. I'm excited about the possibilities of that. But yeah, just to speak to Deb, your question of what the overall sort of detrimental aspects of layoffs, not only for at the personal level, but at sort of like the big picture level of a company. Companies think that layoffs are going to save them money, and the research shows that it doesn't. Over 3 years, most companies lose profitability after a mass layoff. They are losing. Yeah, there's my slideshow. Yeah. So I actually made this slideshow as part of our layoff negotiations at New York Public Radio. Before the layoffs happened, I was really, really proud to have organized 30 new workers into our existing SAG-AFTRA union at New York Public Radio. And then right after that, there started to be, mumblings of the potential layoffs. So I joined the collective bargaining team. We were in the middle of collective bargaining that same year, last year, when our layoffs also were coming in. And so quickly that collective bargaining, panel of workers, we ended up becoming the layoff negotiation panel. So during the time when we were negotiating with the company, we did several things to try and show them that this is not the only way that you can go. If you're worried about advertiser money, there are other things that you can do about that. And here are some of the things that you can look at instead. So yeah, as I was saying, if you go back to productivity, so there are a lot of hidden costs to layoffs. This is borne out in lots of research, particularly the Harvard Business School has been a leading place for the research on the overall effects of layoffs on companies. You end up having a 20% drop in job performance of the people who stay. It's not just hard on the people who go, it's hard on everyone at the company, and you end up losing a lot of trust. If you go to the next slide. So there's a 41% decline in job satisfaction for people who stay. I want to say that actually also includes the managers who have to carry out those layoffs. It is not easy on them either. I can say, from personal experience, the managers who had to deliver this news, who weren't actually part of the decision-making at New York Public Radio to their teams, it was devastating for them. It was also devastating for them. And the data shows that they have higher rates of stress. They have higher rates of developing a new health condition after having been a manager in charge of layoffs. And then there's a decline in work commitment and increase in voluntary turnover. So all of these things together, really contribute to companies not getting the outcomes that they want from laying off a bunch of staff. In our union negotiations, we weren't successful in saving everybody's jobs,
but I am really happy to say that we saved 20 jobs through our last
That's wonderful. We're thank you. So I want to take it low and then make it end up on a high note with everyone. I don't know if you've seen that New Yorker article by Nathan Heller, where he uses the phrase the ambience of information. Have you seen that?
I saw it after you sent it to me.
Oh, okay.
It was really an interesting piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's it's really sort of an election roundup where he talks about how audiences are misunderstanding we're misunderstanding the asymmetric nature of news and information access. I won't go deep into it, but he just talks about all the different ways that people are getting information. And a couple of lines from the pieces that detail, even when it's available, doesn't travel widely after all. Big sloppy notions do. And then also he wrote, in a country where more than half of adults have literacy below a 6th grade level, ambient information, however thin and wrong, is more powerful than actual facts. So I'm just looking at like the overall context of people who still go to work every day, who are dealing with the fallout of all of these missing bites, and then the people who are slept out of their newsrooms and often to the wild to deal with everything on their own. And I'm looking for, in the spirit of solutions journalism and covering the response to the pressing social problem, where we'll get our strength from in sustaining a healthy news ecosystem and stabilizing the industry when we're seemingly outclassed by the ambience of information. And don't even get me talking about AI.
I feel like this is a hot potato. I think it's really scary when you start to think about the sophistication of misinformation and how technology can spread it. And this is actually, not to come back to my hobby horse of independent journalists being the solution to everything, but when people know and trust the individual who's serving them news, that can be one solution. Right? When you're following someone who you know their reporting standards and their ethics, if we're connected more closely, and those close connections are going to build trust, that's one thing. The other thing is I do think we need to just completely, we need to stop doing the things we've always done because we've always done them, and really think about what does our community need? What is our audience concerned about? What's the most effective and efficient medium with which to deliver that story or that information or that life-saving resource? And just, do the things that have the biggest impact and stop doing the other stuff just because we've already done it. So that's one concern.
Right.
Yeah, I'll take the hot potato on this one. So the one thing that worries me a lot, and I think it worries the foundations that are now involved in Press Forward, is the impact of all of these news deserts and job losses and loss of coverage on communities and on democracy. And I think what we're seeing and what we just saw is a wildfire of misinformation and disinformation. And part of it has to do with lack of access to local, credible, verified news and information. And so I think we've got to solve this problem. And if we're going to attack the larger issue of the weakening of the democratic institutions as a result of misinformation, disinformation. One quick stat, are you all familiar with pink slime? Pink slime local news sites? Do you know there now is a study out there, more pink slime, these are fake, I can't call them news sites, but they're fake sites that look like news sites, but they're really just PAC-driven, ideological-driven sites. There are now more of those in the U.S. than there are daily newspapers. That's how pervasive this problem has become. So this is a serious issue. In our bright spots, and we've seen it now in several examples across the country, the news organizations that are getting it right are the ones that are closest to their community and the ones that are listening to their community. One of my favorite bright spots in the study that we just did is Connecta, Arizona. So there's a woman who's a journalist for. Yes, you know her.
She just won 3 press club awards in Arizona.
Well, she deserved all 3 of them. And I actually just highlighted her in LinkedIn. I posted about her on LinkedIn today. But Connect Arizona. So talk about listening to your audience. And a quick story. So she was a journalist for Univision, then was doing some freelance journalism work. And during COVID, she saw all this misinformation that was being spread about COVID. And she said, you know what, I got to do something about this. This is ridiculous. So she started a WhatsApp group. Relatively small, and this thing just took off. And it just burgeoned. I mean, it grew out of a small WhatsApp group. Connect Arizona now has a radio show, a podcast, a full-blown news site that covers news along the border in Arizona, and a newsletter. And they're doing great work. And it all started from this idea that she had of listening to her audience and trying to do something about misinformation and disinformation. And she's built a very now successful news organization as a result of that. And there's also, Deb knows, Outlier Media in Detroit, which is delivering news and information via text message. And they communicate with their audience through text message. And a lot of it is, what do I need to know about your community that you would like for us to investigate, like to look into? And Outlier Media is now really becoming a major player in the local ecosystem in Detroit. So I think we're going to see these new platforms, these new ways of communicating with audience that will bring us closer, and that also raises trust and improves trust with the audience. So anyway, that's my happy ending to my otherwise
Thank you.
gloomy set.
I don't have happy things to say.
Lay it on us.
So this is where my students sigh because, oh Lord, Dr. Clark is going to talk about white supremacy again. But I am. White supremacy and the systems that are built out of it, including capitalism, don't factor for a down cycle. If you are not producing at a high enough level, then you find another way to exploit a different group in order to increase your profits. And if you think about how that works, then you can very clearly see about how it's worked in journalism. We've been bought out by hedge fund managers because our bosses couldn't make enough money for the shareholders, but these guys who had more money and could buy multiple properties did just that to create more money for themselves, right? And so where I see the place that we need to start is the same place that this country needs to start, and that is with being honest about our history and what we consider local news to be, in our specific case, what we consider local news to be, right? Because we talk about local news and we talk about these innovative solutions, but these solutions are born out of that vacuum that was created when people who were in power said, you can't do news that way. Or the kind of news that you do, that's actually advocacy. That's not journalism. And so they pushed away this audience that if they had the audience today, we probably wouldn't be experiencing the same thing. And this all came back to me because you asked the question about the Heller story. How did I miss that story? It's behind a paywall. Yeah. And if I have a decision to make about how to spend my money, like, yes, I could rely on UNC to buy that story for me. But if I have to decide on how I'm going to spend my money, I'm going to invest it in the communities that know how to turn the stories around with a shoestring. The ones that have been operating and continue to operate even as the corporate entities fail. Because they know what it means to be connected to community, to tell the stories in the ways that the community needs and the way that the community can access. Because they have dealt with the history of, in their case, being left out. And so until we actually take into account the structures that we have built or the structures that we have been complicit in, and I point at myself in the same way, we cannot, we're going to have a beautiful, bright moment. It's going to be great for a little while, and then we are going to fall into the down cycle again.
Hi.
I think that was the mic drop moment. And we're going to leave it at that. Let's thank our panelists.